It was Mother's Day. I was standing in my living room holding this little plastic sunflower. The tag was still hanging from it, $4.99. No card, no hug, just a text from Melissa that said, "Here's something for you. Hope you like yellow." She had just gotten back from giving her mother-in-law a $50,000 ring and surprising her with a cruise to the Bahamas. I saw the videos on Facebook. Everyone smiling, raising glasses, celebrating. There was a caption that said, "So lucky to have the world's best second mom." And I just stood there, alone. I'm Evelyn Mathers. I'm 67. I used to run a small ceramic studio in Albany. I've been a widow for 15 years. I'm a mother, or at least I was. These days, I feel more like a background character, just a quiet presence in the carefully curated photo album of Melissa's perfect life. But it wasn't always like that. I remember scraping together rent money from diner tips, skipping lunch so she could have lunch money, painting mugs at midnight just to keep up with orders. When her father passed, I was the one holding everything together with one hand while holding her close with the other. And now, this. The house still smelled faintly of the lemon scones I had baked earlier, just in case. The tea on the table had gone cold. A soft spring breeze moved through the window, nudging the curtains and brushing against the picture frames on the wall. Her high school graduation, her wedding. And in each of those photos, there I was in the background, always smiling, always there. I sat down on the couch and held the plastic sunflower up to the light. It caught the sun just enough to look almost real. Almost. It looked like the kind of thing you grab last minute in the checkout aisle when you suddenly remember it's Mother's Day. But what got to me wasn't the gift. It was the fact that she knew. She knew lilies were my favorite. Her father used to bring them home every spring, wrapped in brown paper, still damp with dew. When she was little, she would draw them in crayon and tape them to the fridge. But I guess Lillian prefers sunflowers. The sadness didn't hit me all at once. It came slowly, like a quiet unraveling. Not dramatic, not loud. Just this slow feeling of not being remembered, of not mattering. My eyes welled up, but the tears didn't fall. That kind of grief sits deeper than where tears can reach. I opened my phone again. No missed calls. Just a message from Carla, an old friend I hadn't heard from in years. She wrote, "Still doing pottery? There's an artisan market coming up. You should think about it." And I almost laughed. Think about it? I hadn't stepped into my studio in over a year, maybe even 2. I went back to scrolling on Facebook. There was a video of Melissa and Jared on the cruise, placing a necklace around Lillian's neck. The wind was blowing through their hair. They were holding champagne, and the caption underneath said, "Family is everything." I closed the app, got up, walked to the trash can with the sunflower still in my hand. I stood there for a moment, holding it over the bin. Then I paused. Instead of letting it go, I lowered my hand and placed it on the windowsill. The afternoon sunlight hit the plastic petals just right, and they looked a little brighter there. They didn't know I had already stopped pretending. Maybe I'll keep it there, not as something to cherish, but as a quiet reminder. A reminder of what was never real, and of what I don't need to chase anymore. The plastic flower stayed on the windowsill for months. Sometimes, when the evening light caught it just right, it shimmered like it might still be alive. But when I looked at it closely, it was exactly what it was. Cheap, hollow, still. That summer was especially heavy. The air felt thick, and even with the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, the room stayed damp and warm. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea, watching the condensation slide down onto the coaster. The radio was playing low in the background, Blue Bayou. That song always had a way of making things ache a little more. That was when the email came in. It was from Jared. The subject line said, "Lillian's retirement celebration." I blinked at it. Lillian? Melissa's mother-in-law, a woman I had met exactly twice, once at their wedding rehearsal dinner, and once again when I hosted a baby shower years ago. Both times, she wore the same perfume, that powdery, overly sweet kind that always made my eyes sting. The message itself was brief. "We're collecting contributions for Lillian's cruise celebration. Thought you might want to participate. Jared." There was no greeting, not even a simple, "Hi, Evelyn," just the message. I took a sip of tea and stared at the screen. At first, I didn't feel anything. Then it settled in. A dull ache, the kind you get from a bruise you forgot was there until something bumps it. Jared used to call me Mom. I remember that first Christmas he spent with us. He handed me a little box of hand lotion and said, "For you, Mom." Melissa had beamed with happiness. We were all younger back then, softer, kinder. Now it was Mrs. Mathers, on the rare occasion he addressed me at all. I hovered over the reply button, not sure what to say. Eventually, I typed, "I'll have to check my budget. Thanks for thinking of me." I sat with that sentence for a moment, then I deleted the entire thread. I could hear Gary's voice in my head, the way I always do when the house gets too quiet. He used to say, "You don't have to pay your way into someone's love." And he was right, but he never saw Melissa like this. He never saw me like this. I remembered the time she was in college. I had scraped together every dollar I could for months and surprised her with a used Honda Civic. She cried so hard she couldn't even start the engine. Through tears, she said, "You didn't have to do this." And I told her, "I know, but I wanted to." That was the difference. Now it felt like I was expected to contribute so that a woman I barely knew could drink mimosas on a cruise. That night, I didn't sleep much. The house groaned the way it always does in the heat, expanding and settling. Around 2 in the morning, my phone buzzed, a voicemail. I didn't listen to it right away, but by the time morning came, I played it while standing at the sink. It was Melissa's voice, sharp, tired. She said, "Don't be dramatic, Mom. It's just a nice gesture. Everyone's contributing." That word, everyone, echoed louder than the rest. Everyone. Except me. I played the message twice. Then I walked down the back hallway and opened the door to my old studio. Dust covered everything. The shelves, the tiles, the tools. My old kiln stood in the corner, quiet and rusted. I didn't really know what I was looking for, but as I ran my hand along the edge of the work table, something settled in me, like a small thought dropping into a still pond. Maybe it's time I did something just for me. The studio smelled exactly the way I remembered. There was that mix of clay dust, mineral glaze, and old wood warmed by the sun. Nothing in the room had changed, but I had. When I opened the windows, the hinges let out a long groan. Outside, the cicadas buzzed with that familiar electric hum of late summer. Sunlight spilled into the room, and the dust in the air caught the light like tiny constellations. Everything had been still for far too long. It had been years since I touched a wheel, but as I ran my hands across the table, past the worn ribs and wire tools, over the cracked splash pans, something in me responded. Not the technique, not yet, but the rhythm was still there. The presence, the quiet. Gary used to tell me, "You make quiet things loud, Evelyn. That's your gift." I always laughed when he said that. I'd hand him a teacup or a little vase, and he'd hold it like it was some ancient treasure. I never fully believed him. But now, I think maybe he was trying to help me remember who I was, even before I started to forget. The floor creaked as I walked around the room. A few old pots sat on the shelf. Some had been glazed, others were left unfinished. One had a crack running straight through the base. I picked it up anyway and let my thumb trace along the scar. It didn't bother me like it used to. Most of that day passed in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. It was just me, a bucket of warm water, a sponge, and the slow, steady process of cleaning a life I had paused for too long. By late afternoon, I found the old sketch pad. It was tucked behind a jar of dried glaze. My fingers traced along the paper before I opened it. The pages were full of ideas I had once dreamed of starting, but never did. Some because I didn't have time, others because I didn't have the courage. The floor creaked as I walked around the room. A few old pots sat on the shelf. Some had been glazed, others were left unfinished. One had a crack running straight through the base. I picked it up anyway and let my thumb trace along the scar. It didn't bother me like it used to. Most of that day passed in silence. I didn't turn on the radio, I didn't check my phone. It was just me, a bucket of warm water, a sponge, and the slow, steady process of cleaning a life I had paused for too long. By late afternoon, I found the old sketch pad. It was tucked behind a jar of dried glaze. My fingers traced along the paper before I opened it. The pages were full of ideas I had once dreamed of starting, but never did. Some because I didn't have time, others because I didn't have the courage. I flipped to a blank sheet and drew a simple outline. A bowl shaped like a lily. Open, soft, strong. Something that, somehow, felt like me. And then, for the first time in nearly 10 years, I lit the kiln. The sound of the flame rushing to life made me jump back. I laughed at myself, at how jittery I was. The smell of burning dust filled the air. It was strange, but somehow comforting. It felt like lighting a candle on the anniversary of something you can't quite name. I sat down at the wheel and let the clay settle between my palms. I felt its coolness, its weight, the quiet pull as it spun beneath my hands. It wasn't perfect. The shape wobbled, my wrist started to cramp, and just when it was starting to rise into something graceful, the whole thing collapsed into a slumped, wet pile. I looked at it for a while. Then I looked down at my hands, covered in gray streaks. My apron was damp and spotted, but instead of feeling defeated, I laughed, really laughed. The sound came from deep inside me, and it caught me off guard. It was full, raw, almost youthful. I didn't leave it there. I reached for another lump of clay. By the time the sun dipped low, I was cleaning up. My muscles ached in ways they hadn't in years, but it was the kind of ache that feels good, the kind you earn. Before I turned out the lights, I pulled out the old notebook Gary had given me for our 30th anniversary. It had a soft leather cover and a quote written on the inside flap. It said, "Make things that outlast storms." I flipped to the first page and wrote, "Project Mother's Hands." Then I sat there for a while, listening to the soft crackle of the kiln warming up in the corner. I didn't know what all this would turn into. Not exactly, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like something was starting, and this time it had my name on it. I hadn't told Melissa that I'd reopened the studio. Honestly, I hadn't told her much of anything lately. There didn't really seem to be a reason. She hadn't asked about my life in years. But then, one afternoon, she showed up. No call, no text, just a knock on the doorframe, and there she was. She walked in like she still remembered every corner of the place, like part of her believed it still belonged to her somehow. She looked around, squinting a little, like the light was too much. Then she said, "Still doing this, huh?" The way she said it stung more than I cared to admit, like this was some little hobby I'd never grown out of. She reached out and ran her fingers across the windowsill, leaving a line in the dust I hadn't gotten around to wiping away. "It smells the same," she said, eyes drifting toward the shelves, "like wet dirt and old summer camp." I gave her a small smile, though it didn't go very deep. "That's clay and pine wood," I said, "and maybe a little age." She didn't laugh, just glanced down at her phone, then back up at me. "I can't stay long. Jared and I are going to Montauk this weekend." I nodded and reached for the kettle. "Would you like some tea?" She waved it off. "Nah, I'm in a rush." She paced the room slowly, but I could tell she wasn't really looking at anything. Her heels made soft clicks against the concrete floor. Then she said, "So," and let the word hang in the air. "I actually came by to ask if you could do us a favor." I didn't say anything. I waited. She said, "Could you pick up Lillian's anniversary cake on Saturday? We won't be around. It's one of those fancy fondant ones. It's already paid for. You just need to grab it and bring it to the restaurant by 5. She said it like she was asking me to water the plants. I looked at her, calm and steady. "No," I said. Just that. "No." She blinked. "Wait, what?" "I'm not available Saturday," I told her. She tilted her head and let out a short, almost nervous laugh. "Are you mad at me or something?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I didn't think she would really hear it. Instead, I walked over to the shelves where the lily bowls were drying in a row. I picked one up carefully. The glaze was a soft ivory, the petals wide, the edges just slightly rippled. It wasn't perfect, but it was made with care. I brought it back and gently placed it in her hands. "I made this for you," I said. She looked down at it, then up at me. "What's this?" "It's a lily, a real one," I said, "not plastic." Her mouth opened a little, like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. She stared at the bowl like it was written in a language she used to know but couldn't quite remember anymore. The silence stretched just long enough for me to walk over and open the door. I didn't say anything else, and neither did she. As she stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face, and just for a second, I saw a glimpse of that girl who used to cry on this floor over a boy who never deserved her. But she walked away before I could say it, and I didn't follow. She didn't take the bowl, just left it sitting there on the porch railing like it didn't mean a thing. And you know what? I didn't cry. Not this time. That was new for me. The next morning, I boxed it back up and placed it on the studio shelf, right next to the ones that were cracked. Maybe I'd reglaze it someday. Maybe I wouldn't. That Saturday, instead of staying home wondering whether Melissa had even said my name at Lillian's party, I packed up 6 lily bowls and that chipped tea set Gary always liked. I wrapped everything in old dish towels, loaded a folding table into the trunk, and headed to the fall artisan market. The air smelled like cinnamon and kettle corn, sweet and smoky all at once. Leaves were swirling across the pavement in golden little spirals, people were strolling with mugs of cider, couples were holding hands, and toddlers were waddling around in puffy fleece jackets, their arms sticking out like tiny snowmen. I found my spot between a woman selling beeswax candles shaped like pumpkins and a painter whose canvases shimmered with wild, beautiful color. I had barely finished setting up my sign when the candle lady leaned over and said, "You're new." She had short white hair streaked with silver blue and wore a denim jacket covered in paint, like it had lived there for years. Her name tag said, "Carla. Yes, I take commissions." I gave her a small smile. "I'm Evelyn." She handed me a thermos. Apple cider, homemade. There's a splash of something in it, but don't ask what. I took a sip. It was warm, spiced, and just a little wicked. "Thank you," I said. She nodded toward my table. "These are lovely. You made them?" I nodded. First time showing anything. "Well, welcome to the circus," she said with a grin. "Don't worry, none of us know what we're doing the first time. Honestly, half of us still don't." We started talking, easy and natural. She was a widow too, 5 years in. Her kids lived in Portland and only really texted when they needed something. She had this sharp sense of humor, soft eyes, and a laugh that made you feel like you'd just been handed a secret. We traded stories about raising daughters, about quiet kitchens, about the strange way grief settles into your morning routine like a napkin you forget to unfold. A woman in a red coat stopped by my booth and ran her fingers along one of the bowls. Then she picked up another and studied the shape of the petals. She said, "These feel like someone still believes in love." I blinked and told her, "They're modeled after lilies. I call them memory flowers." She bought 2. Didn't ask for a discount, just paid and walked away. After she left, Carla leaned in and asked, "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "I think I am." She pulled a card out of her purse and slid it across the table. "We've got a dinner thing, me and a few other women. Some widowed, some divorced, a few just plain done with men. We eat too much, talk too loud, and sometimes dance in the kitchen. You should come." I looked at the card. "Do you serve cider?" "Buckets of it," she said. I paused, then smiled. "All right, I'll come." Carla bumped my elbow. "Good, we've been needing a potter." As the sun dipped low and the crowd began to thin out, I packed up my things slowly. There was something soft in the air. Not quite joy, but close, like the warm press of clay in your hands right before the wheel starts to turn. It was just dinner. That's what I kept telling myself as I stood outside Carla's house, holding a casserole dish that was still warm on the bottom. The porch light glowed this soft amber color against the evening sky, and I could already hear laughter coming from inside. Real, unfiltered laughter. Part of me wanted to turn around, but another part of me didn't. There were 6 of us that night, all women, all over 60. Every single one of us had once been someone's everything, a wife, a mother, a caregiver. And now we were something else, something harder to define. Carla greeted me with a big grin and a glass of red wine. She said, "You made it. Good. I told them we needed a potter to balance out all the painters." Her house was warm in every way you can imagine. There was actual heat coming from the fireplace, but there was also that kind of comfort that comes from mismatched furniture and shelves full of books and canvases. The dining table was already crowded. Casseroles lined the surface, a crock pot was steaming in the corner, and there was a basket of homemade rolls tucked into a dish towel. Carla turned to the room and said, "This is Evelyn, new recruit." 4 other women looked up and smiled, the kind of smile only women over 60 seem to have. Kind, steady, no judgment. There was Pat, who used to be a school principal and couldn't talk without using her hands. Sandra wore 3 rings on each finger and carried the scent of sandalwood with her. Loretta had a cane, though she waved it around more like a wand than anything else. And then there was June. Quiet, sharp-eyed, she didn't miss a thing. We sat down and ate without much ceremony. Carla passed the salad like she was dealing cards. Pat cracked a joke about her ex-husband's new wife being allergic to gluten. That one rolled through the room like a warm wave of laughter. Then the story started. Not the kind that ask for pity, the real kind. Sandra said, "I didn't know who I was when he died. Took me a year to realize I actually like jazz. He couldn't stand jazz." Pat chimed in with, "My kids thought I was lonely, so they sent me on a singles cruise. I met Loretta instead." The room broke into laughter again. I didn't speak for a while. I just listened, took it all in. It felt like I was overhearing a language I hadn't heard in years, the kind of language women speak when they've stopped asking permission to be themselves. When it was my turn, I held my wine glass just a little too tightly and said, "I forgot what it felt like to be welcome." That's all I said, and it was enough. Carla raised her glass. To second chances. Loretta added, and third. Then June, with a wink, said, and fourth. We clinked glasses, gently, the way people do when they know what that moment means. Later, we moved into the living room. The fire had quieted down to a soft glow, like the last ember of a story. Pat started humming an old song from the 60s. Someone passed around a tin of chocolate truffles that, at some point, must have held buttons. When I was ready to leave, Carla handed me a scarf. She said, "For the walk and for coming." I wrapped it around my neck, feeling more touched by the gesture than I could explain. Outside, the air was crisp and cool. Leaves crackled beneath my feet. The street was quiet, and porch lights blinked on like gentle little lighthouses guiding people home. At my front door, I checked my phone. There was one new voicemail. It was from Melissa. I didn't listen. I pressed delete. Then I stepped inside, still smiling, still wrapped in that warm scarf. If any part of tonight reminded you of something in your own life, a dinner that caught you off guard, a friend who showed up out of nowhere, or just that quiet kind of bravery it takes to try again, I'd really love to hear about it in the comments. I think sometimes we forget just how many of us are still figuring things out, one little step at a time. And if you've been here for a while, or even if this is your first time, feel free to subscribe. I'll be sharing more of this story soon, and the next part, let's just say things begin to shift in ways I honestly didn't see coming. So tell me, what would you have done after a night like that? I used to think healing would come with some big, dramatic moment, maybe a tearful apology on a porch swing, or a dinner where everything that had been buried for years finally came pouring out. But it didn't happen like that, not even close. It looked more like a quiet Sunday morning. I was standing at the kitchen window, waiting for a text that never came, and making the choice not to send one either. The sunlight slipped through the curtains in soft, golden strips, warming the tile beneath my bare feet. My phone sat there on the counter, screen facing up. No calls, no messages. I reached for it without thinking, like I always did. My thumb hovered over Melissa's name, the way it always did on Sundays. She used to wait for me to make the first move, and I always did. But not today. I turned the phone face down. The coffee was bubbling in the pot, that familiar, bitter scent filling the kitchen like it always did. Outside, the trees were bare and swaying in the winter breeze. Off in the distance, I heard church bells. That sound used to make me feel small, like I was missing something. Now it just felt steady, like background music for a life I was still learning how to live. I poured myself a cup and stood at the sink, both hands wrapped around the warmth of the mug. Then the phone rang. It was Carla. "Morning," she said, her voice full of that natural cheer I'd grown to love. "Tell me you're submitting something for the winter gallery show." I smiled before I could stop myself. "I don't know, Carla." "Nope, no hesitation. You've got that whole kiln whisperer thing going now. People need to see your work. So, are you in?" I hesitated, then let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "All right, fine, but if they hate it?" "They won't, and if they do, they're just wrong." We laughed. It was light and easy. After we hung up, I looked around the kitchen like it might offer me something. Instead, my eyes landed back on the phone. The voicemail icon was still blinking. It was that same message from 2 weeks ago. I tapped it open. Melissa's voice came through, clipped, all business. "Hey, just a reminder about Lillian's cake. You said you'd let us know about the pickup. Jared wants to know by Thursday. Anyway, let me know." That was it. No greeting, no check-in, no warmth. Just another thing to do. I sat down slowly. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. Just empty. Like I'd been standing in place, waiting for something that had already passed right by me. My finger hovered again, this time over delete. Then it moved to block, and I paused. Not because I wanted to hurt her. It wasn't even about feeling hurt anymore. It was about breathing, about no longer living my mornings in quiet panic, wondering if silence meant something was wrong. So I pressed it, blocked the number. Done. I looked out the window again, and this time it didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. It felt like there was finally space. Later that afternoon, I opened my email. The submission page for the art show was still open. I uploaded a few photos of the lily bowls and typed in the title slowly. Submission title, Mother's Hands. Then I hit send. The coffee had gone cold by then, but I poured myself another cup anyway. And for once, it didn't feel like I was trying to fill the silence. It felt like I had chosen it. My hands didn't stop shaking the entire drive. Carla called it good nerves. I called it something that felt a lot closer to panic. But I kept going anyway. I drove down Maple Street, through that old roundabout near the post office, and past the bakery that still sells the same apple fritters Gary used to bring home on Saturdays. I parked around the corner from the community gallery. My scarf was knotted too tight. My palms were damp. I sat there behind the wheel a minute longer than I meant to, just staring at the plain brick building with its white painted trim. And then, like pulling a loose thread from a sweater, I finally opened the door and got out. Inside, the room buzzed softly. White walls, bright lights, that faint museum scent of dust and quiet ambition. There was music playing, something classical, maybe Chopin. I spotted Carla right away. She was already holding court near a display of watercolor landscapes, wearing deep red earrings and that familiar grin of hers that said, "See, I told you this is where you belong." My corner was quieter. A folding table draped with soft linen, 3 lily bowls, 2 chipped tea sets, 1 small plate with a crack I couldn't bring myself to throw away. They weren't perfect, but they were mine. I adjusted Gary's pin on my scarf, a little brass lark he gave me on our 10th anniversary. Then I took a small step back. A woman with short gray hair and warm, gentle eyes stopped in front of my table. She leaned forward and lightly touched the rim of the largest bowl. "Why lilies?" she asked. Her tone was curious, not critical. I paused for a second, then said the first thing that came to me and felt honest. Because they outlasted silence. She smiled, just nodded, like that made perfect sense without needing any further explanation. A little while later, a younger man walked up. He had a press badge and a notebook. His name was Nathan, and he was writing something for the local paper. "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions about your work?" he asked. My first instinct was to brush it off, say I was just a hobbyist, nothing serious. But something in me hesitated, and instead, I found myself telling him the truth. I told him about the kiln, about how it sat unused for years. I shared how I used to make bowls for dinner parties, and then later, for birthdays I wasn't invited to anymore. I didn't mention names. I didn't have to. The clay already said enough. Nathan took notes while I talked. He really listened. Then he said, "There's something steady about your work. It feels like it's been waiting to be seen." That night, when I got home, I left my scarf on. I sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, and for the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel quite so hollow. The article came out the next morning. The title was "A Second Bloom, One Widow's Quiet Defiance." There was a photo of me standing beside the lily bowls, caught mid-laugh, probably something Carla had said, and the quote they used underneath was, "You don't need to shout to take up space." Around noon, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa. She said, "Nice article. Didn't know you were doing that." No apology, no warmth, just that same detached tone I had gotten used to, like she was keeping tabs. That was all. I didn't answer. Instead, I slipped the phone into the drawer and went back into the studio. The kiln was still warm from the last firing. There was a half-shaped vase waiting on the wheel. And for once, I wasn't thinking about what she thought of me. I was thinking about what I wanted to shape next. Melissa's text sat there, unopened, for 3 days. I saw it every time I checked the weather or set an alarm, but I let it stay, like a small stone sitting on the edge of a lake, just enough weight to notice it was there, but not enough to pull me under. When I finally responded, I didn't overthink it. I just typed, "Thank you." That was it. It wasn't cold. It was clear. That morning, the rain came in soft. I could hear it tapping gently against the bedroom windows, like a rhythm I'd always known. I pulled the quilt tighter around my shoulders and stared up at the ceiling. February always brought a certain kind of ache. Nathan used to call it the long sigh before spring. I hadn't opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand in years. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for until I found it. His handwriting. It was the letter he left me on our last anniversary before all the hospital visits began. Cream-colored paper, ink that had already started to fade. I unfolded it slowly, like the paper might bruise in my hands. There was one line that stayed with me. You were never less than enough. I sat there on the bed, running my fingers over a small stack of old journals. Most were filled with grocery lists and half-written dreams I never followed through on, but tucked in between the cluttered pages, I kept finding different versions of the same sentence. I hope Melissa needs me. I hope she calls soon. I hope she still wants me around. And suddenly it hit me, quiet and clear, just how long I had tied my worth to being needed, how that belief had settled in over the years, slipping into me like dust collecting in corners of the house I stopped noticing. The plastic flower was still sitting on the dresser, still there, still pretending to be beautiful. I picked it up and walked down the hallway to the guest room. I opened the top drawer, the one with the holiday linens and candles I always forget to light, and I placed it inside, gently. Then I closed the drawer. On my way back, I stopped by the bookshelf and pulled out the notebook I now kept just for me, not for lists, not for tasks, just for my own thoughts. I tore out a clean page, and I wrote, I am still the mother, but I'm also a woman, and I am not waiting anymore. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. I just sat there, still and quiet, with that rare feeling you get when something inside you finally clicks back into place. Later that evening, the phone rang. Her name lit up the screen. Melissa. I watched it buzz once, then twice, then 3 times. And then it stopped. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel cold. I just felt centered. There's a kind of peace that doesn't make a scene. It doesn't kick down doors or raise its voice. It just sits beside you, steady and quiet, asking for nothing except the chance to stay. So I let it. And outside, the rain kept falling, soft, steady, entirely its own. You'd think peace would show up with a bit of flair, trumpets, some kind of revelation, maybe even a grand parade of closure. But that's not how it happened for me. It slipped in quietly one spring morning while I was trimming the dead leaves off the basil plant. No announcement, no big moment, just presence. I had stopped waiting for the doorbell, stopped glancing through the blinds every time a car slowed down in front of the house. Now I watered the porch plants just because they were mine, not because someone might stop by and notice, not for occurrences, just for the simple reason that they bloomed when I did. The lilies were the first to return that year, tall, a little wild. I'd planted them late last season, not sure they'd survive the frost, but they did, and they came back with more color than I remembered. Not showy, just quietly vivid. Across the street, the park was coming back to life too. Kids in strollers, kites floating through the air, that same dog who barked at every squirrel he saw and never caught a single one. That's how I met Marcy. She had just moved into the neighborhood. Early 50s, always on the go. Bright sneakers, hair pulled up in a messy ponytail, and a little rescue terrier named Buttons who clearly hated being on a leash. One morning, while I was snipping some rosemary, she waved and called out, "Smells amazing over there. Do you cook or just garden like a magician?" I laughed and told her, "Bit of both." That afternoon, she came by with a mismatched teacup and a tin of ginger cookies. Said she hadn't baked much since her divorce, but figured herbs might forgive clumsy hands. We sat on the porch together. The sun was thick in the air, and the conversation felt easy. She told me about her grown sons who lived too far away and didn't call enough. I told her about Clay, about how silence, sometimes, cracks things open in ways you don't expect. Later that same week, the director of the park stopped by my studio. He said he'd seen the article from last winter and asked if I'd consider teaching a beginner pottery class through the community rec program. My first thought was to say no. But when I mentioned it to Carla over the phone, she cut me off before I could finish. She said, "Oh, come on. You've been shaping things alone long enough. Let someone else try. Worst case, you teach one awkward teenager how not to blow up a kiln. So I wrote a list. I called it Things I Do Just for Me. Before that day, there were only 3 things on it. I added teach a class as the 4th. When the class started, I wore my oldest apron and packed extra sponges. 10 people showed up. One woman had never touched clay before. A retired mechanic brought his granddaughter, who was determined to make a bowl for her hamster. A boy, maybe 9, raised his hand and asked, "Is this hard?" I smiled and told him, "Only if you care too much about being perfect." Everyone laughed, and in that moment, I realized how true that was. That evening, back home, with the sun still golden and stretching across the porch, I sat with a cup of mint tea and watched the last bit of light fall across the lilies. My phone buzzed once. A voicemail. It was from Melissa. She said, "We're hosting Mother's Day brunch this year. Lillian thinks you probably won't come, but I'm inviting you." Her voice was steady. It didn't waver, but it didn't soften either. Just that same middle tone I knew so well. Practical, measured. I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I placed it face down and took another sip of tea. Outside, the lilies swayed gently in the breeze. Still standing. Still untouched. I stood in front of my closet longer than I probably should have. There was that burgundy blouse, tucked toward the back. Same one I wore to Lillian's christening. Same one Melissa once said made me look a little too eager. I touched the sleeve for a second, then let it be. Instead, I reached for something simpler. A navy linen top. Clean, soft, no message in it, nothing performative. I didn't go to prove a point. I went because I wanted to, because I could. Melissa's house looked just the way I remembered. White shutters, pink tulips out front, perfectly aligned, like they'd been placed with a ruler. She opened the door after I knocked twice. Her smile was polite, a little uncertain. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I answered. She paused for a beat, then stepped aside. "Come in, Mom." There it was, that word. Not Mrs. Mathers, not silence. I walked into a room dressed in pastels and tension. Balloons floated gently in the corners, white tablecloths covered the tables, catered trays sat labeled in elegant cursive, quiche, smoked salmon, fruit skewers. Everything was thought through, placed just right, except maybe the emotions. A woman with perfectly done highlights gave me a vague nod. A man I didn't recognize said Happy Mother's Day like he was checking it off a list. And then I heard the voice that made everything else disappear. "Grandma!" Lillian ran toward me from the backyard, her hair wild and her smile wide. She wrapped her arms around my waist with the kind of love that doesn't second-guess itself. "I made you something," she said, pulling a folded paper from her tiny purse. It was covered in crayon drawings, lilies, a smiling sun with way too many eyelashes. "You're in the garden with me and Mommy. That's you in the blue dress." I felt my eyes sting. I told her I love it. She beamed at me, then ran off again, already yelling about cupcakes. I moved through the brunch like I'd rehearsed it, nodded, smiled, sipped orange juice, talked with one of Jared's cousins about community gardens, stayed mostly on the edge of things, and honestly, I was okay with that. Sometime in the afternoon, Melissa walked over. I could hear her heels before I saw her. She was holding a small white box tied neatly with twine. "I didn't know what to get you," she said, "so it's a candle, lavender." She handed it to me quietly, no big moment. I looked at her, really looked, not through her, not past her, just at her. "That's okay," I said. She knit her brows just slightly, but she didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain. As the sun lowered, I gathered my things. I thanked the host, hugged Lillian again, told Melissa, take care. She walked me to the door. "You seemed," she hesitated, "different." I stepped out onto the porch, the candle cradled in my arm like it might break if I held it too tightly. "Maybe I am," I said. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to. The lilies along the driveway were just beginning to bloom. Quiet, defiant, alive anyway. If you've ever stepped into a room and felt like a stranger in your own family, I understand. And if you've ever found the strength to show up anyway, exactly as you are, I hope you'll share that moment. Sometimes it's the tiniest act that shifts everything. So let me ask you this. When was the last time you did something just for yourself? Stick around. What's coming next? Even I didn't see it coming. I didn't keep the candle. I lit it, watched the wick catch and bloom into a soft, steady flame. The lavender scent drifted through the kitchen and into the studio, like it had always belonged there. Letting it burn felt like a quiet little ceremony, just for me. I didn't say anything out loud, but I could feel it. That part of me that used to wait, used to hope, used to bend and make space for everyone else, it finally settled, calm, still. The kiln ticked behind me as it cooled down from last night's firing. Outside, the maple leaves had started turning gold and falling, slow and steady. Inside, Billie Holiday was playing softly in the background. There was a pot of tea steaming near the window, and 2 of my beginner students were sitting at the wheel, hands clumsy, focused, covered in clay. I leaned over to the younger one and said gently, "Remember, it's okay to mess up. Clay forgives. You just center again." She looked up, a little uncertain. "Really?" I nodded. "Really." The studio didn't look the same anymore. It looked better. It looked lived in. You could see the tiny thumbprints along the wall shelves, mugs drying next to the sink, even a patch of paint on the floor from when Marcy knocked over an easel by accident. And in the far corner, right above the framed article from 2 years ago, the one called A Second Bloom, I'd added something new. It was the last piece I made just for me. A tall vase, simple shape, painted with lilies and a soft watercolor sun. I hadn't meant to add the sun. It just appeared on the brush, like it had been waiting. I never named that one. Didn't have to. Marcy showed up around noon, a tote bag on her shoulder and sunglasses pushed back in her hair. "I brought trail mix, lemon water, and the worst playlist you've ever heard," she said with a grin. "You coming?" I smiled. "No cruise this time?" "Just snacks and bad singing," she said. "Way better." I laughed, rinsed my hands, and told the students to lock up when they were done. Marcy waited on the porch while I took one last slow walk through the yard. The garden had come in beautifully. The lilies were still blooming, late and stubborn, in one sunny corner. The herbs were spilling into the walkway, thyme and rosemary stretching toward each other like they'd missed one another. I passed the porch swing, the same one I used to sit on with my phone in hand, waiting for Melissa's call. It didn't creak anymore. I'd fixed the hinges. Above the swing was a little windchime I'd made this past spring, blue and white, shaped like sea glass and soft little bells. I hadn't realized how much I loved that sound until just then. I paused, reached up and touched it lightly, then let my fingers fall. "I did good," I whispered, and for the first time in a long time, I meant it. There weren't any grand reunions, no big applause, just the steady warmth of my own breath in the crisp autumn air and the quiet joy of knowing I'd rebuilt something soft and strong, something that was fully mine. Somewhere behind me, Marcy honked the car horn twice, impatient and teasing. I turned toward her, and I walked. I didn't look back. Somewhere between the scent of lavender and the soft sound of that wind chime, I realized something. I hadn't just rebuilt a studio, I'd rebuilt myself. Not for praise, not for forgiveness, just because I could. Sometimes healing doesn't mean getting back what we lost. Sometimes it means letting go of the ache to be understood and choosing peace instead. In a world that constantly tells us to quiet down, growing older gives us the strength to speak, gently but clearly, to say who we are and what we need. Because real love, the kind that matters, never asks you to disappear to deserve it. If anything in this story felt familiar to you, if you've walked through silence and found your voice again on the other side, I'd love to hear it, truly. And if you'd like to walk alongside me a little longer, in the next story, a father buries his wife, only to find his son choosing birthday cake over grief. That one's called "My Son Chose His Wife's Party Over His Dad's Funeral, So I Cut Him Out of My Will." And it's a story I still carry deep in my bones.